A special welcome to our chief guest, Mr. Ashish Kothari, environmentalist and founder of Kalpavriksh. Good evening to all our distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. We shall now invoke God's blessing with a prayer song.
Thank you. With the blessings of the divine, I now invite Father Christy, Director of XLRI, to welcome the gathering and introduce the speaker. Father
Good
Christy.
evening to all of you. Dear Mr. Ashish Kothari, Chief Guest of the evening function, Mr. T.V. Narendran, Chairman, XLRI Board of Governors and CEO and MD of Tata Steel Limited, members of the XLRI Governing Board, faculty, fellow Jesuits, students, alumni, staff, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to welcome you all to the 7th Dr.Verghese Kurien Memorial Oration. A special welcome to Mr. Ashish Kothari, who has accepted our invitation to be the speaker today. Let me say a few words why XLRI has instituted this oration in the name of Dr. Verghese Kurien before I introduce the speaker. In line with XLRI's vision to train global leaders for the greater common good and a sustainable future, Father Arupe Center for Ecology and Sustainability was established in 2012 to promote an environmentally, socially, economically sustainable and just society. This center has been named after Father Arupe, former Superior General of the Society of Jesus, who gave a strong thrust on the need to work towards a just and sustainable society by giving preferential option for the poor in all the works of the society. This annual oration is one of the activities of the center, and it provides a platform to listen to and learn from eminent persons who have made a significant contribution to the idea of an empowered, prosperous, sustainable society. This oration has been rightly named after Dr.Verghese Kurien, best known as the father of the White Revolution in India, who is globally recognized as a role model for sustainable development. He helped India to become the largest milk producer in the world. He pioneered the Anand model of dairy cooperatives, which transformed dairy farming, India's largest self-sustaining industry and the largest rural development sector, employment sector. This year, we are fortunate to have Mr. Ashish Kothari, an eminent environmentalist, globally known for his extraordinary contribution to sustainable development, to deliver the 7th Dr.Verghese Kurien Oration. Mr. Ashish is a graduate in sociology from London School of Economics and a former faculty member at Indian Institute of Public Administration and a guest faculty at several universities in India and abroad. He is known for asking probing questions. Are there alternative ways of meeting human needs and aspirations without trashing the earth and without leaving half of humanity behind? In pursuit to find answers, he founded Kalpavriksh, an environmental action group, which has been in the forefront of the struggle for sustainable sanity and sustainability in India for the last 4 decades. He coordinates Vikalp Sangam, a repository of Indian democratic practices, frameworks, and visions that offer fundamental alternatives to today's dominant economic and political system. He has served on several national and international committees and boards. At present, he is the chairman of Greenpeace India's board. He has more than 24 books to his credit. We are indeed privileged to have you, Mr. Ashish Kothari, with us today. On behalf of the XLRI family, I extend a warm welcome to you, and I profusely thank you for accepting our invitation to deliver this oration.
Thank you.
This is the first time we are having this oration virtually. So I thank all those people who have made it possible. And Mr. Ashish is speaking from Pune, where he lives today. So once again, I welcome you all to this oration. Have a pleasant evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Father. May I now request Mr. Ashish Kothari, our chief guest, to deliver his oration. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ashish Kothari.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Hello. Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Father Christy. Thank you, Raghu. Thanks to the entire team in XLRI for this wonderful opportunity. I am so sorry that I am not able to be physically there with you. That would have been even more pleasurable and an honor for me. But given the circumstances, this is certainly better than nothing. Just a couple of corrections in my introduction, Father Christy. It was the Delhi School of Economics, not the London School of Economics. And I dare say the Delhi School is better, or at least was at that time. And I'm no longer chair of Greenpeace India. I'm on the board, but I gave up chairpersonship last year. What I'm going to do over the next maybe about 35 to 40 minutes is present very briefly what I think are the problems with the current model of development and everything that underlies it. But I'll do that very briefly because it's the kind of bad news that if you make the mistake of reading the morning newspaper, you read about quite frequently. Much more of my time I will try and spend on looking at what are the both practical and conceptual and theoretical alternatives for human well-being, which exist already or can be tried out. So let me see if I can share the screen. Yes, is this visible and is it full screen?
Yes, sir. We can see your slide.
Okay, thank you. The words that are on the screen right now, Eco-Swaraj and the Rainbow Recovery, I will explain them as I move along. Now, I think if we look at the sort of dominant narrative of development in India, it is one of glitz and glamour, and India rapidly moving into the 21st century and becoming now the 5th largest economy in the world. Very high rates of growth, economic growth until recently, and multiple different sort of conventional indicators that you can think of in terms of the ownership of assets like mobile phone connections, cars, etc., etc. We seem to be on the path of rapid development, unlike many other countries. But then there is the other side of the picture, which is what we have been focusing on over the last 4 decades, which is what is the kind of ecological, social, economic, cultural impact that this model of development is causing. Now, if you see this particular advertisement, it's from about maybe 30 years back. It's an Indian multinational corporation called Dotsal. And the advertisement is really about the fact that nature is a barrier between us and development. And if nature is a barrier, it has to be uprooted and shoved aside. Now, probably no ad agency will give an ad like this anymore because it will be considered to be politically inappropriate. But the model of development is still exactly what this is. So if you see over the last, even the last 1 decade, and especially the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a very rapid decimation of forests and other ecosystems for the pursuit of development projects like mining and expressways and mass tourism projects and industries and so on. And so we tend to characterize this not as development, but as violence, as a form of violence against nature, as a form of violence against communities, especially those communities who depend most on nature, and against and violence against cultures also, which I'll explain in a while. Globally, we now know that this process of economic growth-led development is causing all kinds of severe global crises. Climate is the one that's being most talked about, but it's much more than that. It's biodiversity loss, it's crossing various different planetary boundaries within which human activity should be located, because once we cross it, then it rebounds on us, as we can see, for instance, with the climate crises. We are already using 1.5 times the resources that the earth can actually provide to us, or that can be regenerated every year. So it's like eating into the capital. If you have a bank account, it's like eating into the deposit that you made rather than just living on the interest. Even in India, there was a study that was done in 2008, which showed that we are well beyond our ecological and biological capacity already. We are twice that capacity, and we are now the 3rd largest footprint in the world. Now, I remember when I was growing up in school, one of the things I was always told is that, okay, this kind of development might have some ecological impacts, but we need it in order to move people out of poverty and to provide employment. A colleague and I did a book, I'll show you the cover of that in a minute, where we analyzed in great detail, using mostly government statistics, as to what is the real picture with regard to poverty and employment. And what's very interesting is that the last 3 decades or so, where we've had rapid rates of economic growth, have actually mostly been what's called jobless growth. Because for every job that's created, one is lost due to automation, mechanization, or for other reasons. If you think of poverty not just in terms of $1.50 a day or whatever sort of indicators of that kind that are used, gross indicators, and if you think of it more in terms of deprivation from basic needs, which includes healthy living spaces, clean air, clean water, nutritious, adequate food, shelter, opportunities for health and learning, then according to us, at least 70% of India is impoverished, is poor. And it's not just still poor, as in people who were poor, but people actually who were relatively wealthy. If you think of wealthy in terms of well-being, those who were, for instance, had good forests to depend on, or good seas to depend on, or good rivers to depend on, have increasingly actually entered the poverty, the ranks of the poor, because they have been displaced or their resources have been snatched away from them. And that figure of 60 million is astounding, because it's a larger population than most countries of the world. We see also during the COVID lockdown that this kind of very deep fissures in the Indian society, the kind of insecurity that people have been facing in the last few decades, has shown itself very blatantly in the COVID times, when millions of people lost their jobs, many millions had to walk back home, etc. So where is all the money going from this rapid rate of growth? And we now know that India, like the rest of the world, is increasing in terms of inequality, where 5% of India now earns as much as the rest of the 95%. And it enables some of the richest people in the world to be living in some of the poorest cities of the world, such as in Mumbai, where you have the world's largest single family house owned by India's richest man, who you all know. And finally, this is a model of development which has, especially in the last few decades, shrunk spaces for democracy, because when people like us protest, when we resist, when farmers resist, as you can see right now happening in the streets of Delhi, when people who are Adivasis say they don't want to give their forest over for mining or whatever, then the state cracks down, or corporations take action, a lot of it violent, and in the form of then labeling people like us as being anti-national, anti-development, terrorists, and so on and so forth. And this is, of course, again, a global phenomenon. And one other thing, which I think is very important to point out, is that in this process of economic growth-led modernized development that we've seen all over the world, we move from what I call livelihoods, which were not just jobs, they were ways of living with the earth, such as farming and pastoralism and crafts and fisheries and so on small-scale manufacturing, to what is now in the modern sector mostly very boring mechanical jobs. We all tend to fit into a very large chain of production where we have one small cog, and these can be extremely soul-deadening for most people. Of course, some of us are lucky enough to escape that, but for most people, it is this kind of assembly chain jobs. And so I call this a process of moving from livelihoods to deadlihoods, both in the traditional spheres and in the modern spheres. Much more of this analysis is available in this book, 300 pages of it, if you want to get even more depressed than listening to me over the last few minutes. And please take a look at the 2/3 of this book has this kind of analysis. And one final thing I want to say before moving into the alternatives is that the COVID period, never before seen in human history, has given us a very clear two directions in which to go as we move out of the COVID phase. One is what governments and corporations, not all, but many of them are doing, which is to use this as an opportunity or an excuse for greater authoritarianism, for more profit making. You see the figure there of $600 billion profits during the COVID period that a few corporations and billionaires have made. And governments have cracked down more on civil society, use this for more surveillance, etc. But on the other hand, there are also either official or mostly civil society and community initiatives that move towards questioning these systems and moving towards more solidarity-based, more ecologically sensitive ways of living. So we have a very clear choice to make right now. I mean, I'm putting it a bit black and white, but we have a clear choice as to whether we choose one or the other. So the question that arises is, are there alternatives and are they viable? In order to answer that question, it's very important for us to ask alternatives to what? Because one of the things that the system is telling us, that the dominant system is telling us, yes, of course, we are creating problems, but we have solutions. So we have a lot of garbage. We can, I'm getting a lot of background noise. Can people please switch off their mics? Yes, thank you. So we are told, okay, there's a lot of garbage, let's recycle it, or upcycle it is the fancier new word that's being used. We are told that yes, there's a lot of carbon being emitted into the atmosphere. Let's trap it somewhere. Let's create more of sinks, and let's do geoengineering, mass projects around the earth, which will actually reduce the amount of, not reduce the carbon itself, but trap it more, or reduce the warming that's taking place. And to my mind, what these sorts of solutions do not do is address the fundamental roots of the problem. Why do we have unsustainability in the first place? Why do we have inequality and injustice and exploitation in the first place? And the way I characterize it somewhat simplistically is to say, this is because of concentration of power, power to take decisions, power over others, whether it's concentration in the hands of men over women, which is very old, patriarchy and masculinity, or it's concentration in the hands of the state, centralized nation states, which are in many places of the earth becoming even more authoritarian, or it's concentration in the power and in the hands of corporations, private corporations in capitalist situations, or of course we know also with regard to casteism, racism, etc. And finally, power in the hands of humanity over other species, over the rest of nature. To my mind, it's, if we want to think about alternatives, we have to challenge these fundamental structures of power and domination. And that's why we also have to then challenge the kind of pat answers, sort of superficial answers that the system is giving us, including, I'm afraid, sustainable development. We can, in the discussion, I can discuss this more. I think sustainable development, if you look at it in terms of the sustainable development goals, is internally contradictory. You cannot actually have constant growth of material and energy use and throughput in a sustainable way. It's an impossibility. It's an oxymoron. And so there's a serious problem even with something like the SDGs. And finally, what we see in India during the COVID lockdown in May and June, these Atmanirbhar Bharat packages or self-reliance packages that were announced by the Prime Minister, if you really look at them in close detail, you find there's actually nothing about self-reliance in those. The words are used, it's all nice imagery, but you're talking about expanding coal mining in central India in the name of Atmanirbhar Bharat. Mega solar projects. I just came back from Kutch, and one of the most sensitive ecosystems there is currently being given over to the Adanis for this mega solar project, which will then be put out all over the world to say, oh, look, India is meeting the Paris commitments by moving towards renewable energy. But the impact on the ground on both people and on wildlife in that area, nobody's really looking at that. So then what are the real alternatives? And what I'm going to do over the next 10-15 minutes is to actually go through a range of these where people are already practicing it. Now, there's two parts to the alternatives. One, to my mind, is resistance. People who say, no, we don't want this model of development. We do not accept it. This image is from about 30 years back, a movement in central India on the Indravati River by Adivasi communities, where they said no to 2 mega hydro projects that would have displaced about 300 villages and destroyed a lot of the forest that you can see in the background. And while they were protesting, they were not just talking about displacement and the destruction of their livelihoods. They were also saying that for us, this river, for you, the river is megawatts and power. For us, the river is our mother. We will not allow it to be shackled by your walls and dams and so on. And so what you see in these resistance movements is a very different way of looking at the rest of the earth and looking at each other. Very different ways of being, of knowing, of dreaming. And you see this in movements of satyagraha, different parts of the world, including the one right now that we're seeing by farmers in Delhi, in North India. Anti-racism movements, anti-apartheid movements, movements by young people to challenge the climate crisis and the fact that governments are not really acting. To my mind, all of these sorts of resistance movements are part of the alternatives. But at the same time, we also need constructive solutions because people have problems of poverty, of hunger, of injustice, of deprivation. So how do we move towards that? And I'm going to show you many examples of this. There are lots and lots across the world. I'll show you a book later on, which I recently helped to co-edit, which has 100 examples around the world. But first, let me focus on, oh, sorry, I forgot. This map, to me, is a fascinating one. I always use it. I love using it because every time I use it, people say, oh, ye to ulta hai. It's upside down. And I say, but why? If the Earth is round, it depends on where from space you're looking at it, right? As to whether, in fact, Africa should be on top or at the bottom, and Europe should be on top or at the bottom. And if you think of it, the maps we've been using, the so-called the normal maps, are products of colonial times, where Europe was put on top and it was made to look much bigger than it actually is. This is the actual size of the continents that you can see here, where you see how big Africa and how small Europe is. And England, which ruled half the world, completely disappears. So we have to decolonize our minds constantly with regard to how we think also, including things like maps. I am much more familiar, of course, with what's happening on the ground in South Asia. And what we've been doing in the last few years is to document and help document hundreds of examples of alternatives of different kinds, whether it's food or it's health or it's education or it's shelter, it's water, it's governance, it's urban sustainability, livelihoods, all kinds of different things. And I'm going to give you a few examples of these just to give you a glimpse of what's happening on the ground, which we mostly don't hear of. This is my the one that's inspired me the most, because it's from a set of people who are the most oppressed in India: Dalit women, small farmers. They are triply oppressed in terms of caste, gender, and class. In the last about 25 years or so, these Dalit women farmers have gathered together in sanghas in about 75 villages, and then that's formed a larger organization called the DDS, Deccan Development Society. And through these collectives, they have brought back a lot of the traditional seeds of jowar, bajra, ragi, local rice varieties, etc., gone completely organic, collectivized a lot of their farming operations, for instance, collective grain banks, so that everybody has access to seeds for planting, a local PDS system parallel to the government PDS system, which enables a localized farmer-consumer connection, and many other things, innovations they've done, through which they have not just removed the kind of hunger and poverty they had 30 years back, and the kind of situation of deprivation they were in, but moved towards food sovereignty, which means complete control over food, or what can also be called Anna Swaraj, food Swaraj. And in fact, there are movements of this kind in many parts of the world for food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, water sovereignty, land sovereignty, where they say we don't want to be dependent on either the government or corporations. We want complete control over basic needs in our own hands. They've also done a lot of other amazing things, like their own community radio station, their own community filmmaking studio, and much else. And amazingly, the same women who 25 years back were facing hunger and deprivation are today contributing to the COVID relief measures in the district. Another example is from Northeast India, also a women's network, which has been working with farmers and others in Nagaland and a couple of other states, where they have emphasized the retention of traditional systems of practicing both shifting cultivation and settled rice-based cultivation, and retaining your seeds. And in fact, in the COVID period, again, it was because of this that they were relatively food secure compared to a lot of other communities that had not sustained their ways of living. They were also able to put some things into the Kohima market even during the lockdown, so that their economic activities continued. And of course, it's also heavily, both the DDS and this one is heavily based on the rights, the women's rights to land, to seeds, etc. A third one, also a women's collective, and I'm deliberately starting with women's collectives because I think that these are the ones that are really leading the way. This is from Munsiari in Uttarakhand, where this organization called Mati started about 25 years back as a movement against domestic violence, to resolve issues of domestic violence against girls and women, but moved quickly also into economic independence for the women, which included traditional sector like making products out of wool, which they had traditionally skills for, but also then helping to get them trained for new sectors like ecotourism, home-based ecotourism, where the visitor is and the host are on equal grounds, and the visitor is not coming and demanding pizza, but actually eating what the local people eat. And they've also got a lot of the young people to trained in nature guiding, culture guiding, etc. So there's a earning of livelihood through that kind of a option. We move now to Western India, to Kutch. This is a community I've been working with over the last few years, of weavers, handloom weavers. Now, as we know, handicrafts and handloom have collapsed almost all over India, partly as a result of the industrialization policies of post-independence India, and for many other reasons. In this case, in Kutch, also this had collapsed, partly because of that, partly because of the earthquake in 2001. 2004 or 5 onwards, some of the older weavers and an organization called Khamir moved into innovating on the use of local organic cotton called Kala cotton, and created products and a market, because of which the weaving has revived, and about 1,000 looms have come back into operation. And interestingly, young men, and in fact even women who used to not sit on the loom, are coming back into or sustaining themselves on these on handloom weaving and earning a good livelihood. But also, it's not just an economic thing. When we spoke to them in great detail, they were saying it's not just about economic livelihoods. It's also about the fact that we are in control of our work and our time. We can express our own creativity on the loom. We are able to continue the heritage of the community. I can sit and work with my family. I don't have to be sitting in an industry somewhere else. And it's safe work. It's not hazardous work. So all of this put together is what actually creates a very interesting situation. This is another community in Kutch. In fact, I was there just last week, called Kunaria, which had already built up very interesting community health system and disaster management system before COVID. So when COVID hit, they were very well prepared to completely deal with it with almost no government help. And in fact, there's been not a single case of COVID in that community of 3,500 people. But they also did a whole lot of other things. For instance, kids who were stuck at home because of the lockdown, how to entertain them, how to keep them entertained, how to keep them and enhance their learning capacities, and also create a space for the elders who have their own traditional skills of pottery and music and crafts and all, to be able to teach the young people during this period when the kids can't go to school. This is one of the few villages in India where, because the schooling system has also been revived, that several dozen kids have gone back from private schools into the government schools. Imagine this. I mean, this is completely the reverse of, unfortunately, what's happening in the rest of the country. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this program, which is state-sponsored in Kerala, where something like 5 million, I think 50 lakh women get dignified livelihoods wherever they are in their own villages, to produce all kinds of household items, crafts and things like that. And in fact, it was this Kudumbashri network that was really effective in Kerala's being one of the best COVID response states in the country. Moving quickly into another kind of example, in central India, Adivasis in the Gadchiroli area of Maharashtra have moved towards what they call Adivasi Swashasan, or self-rule, where they say that the way we have governed ourselves traditionally and what the government has imposed on us is to erase our Adivasi identity, our tribal identity. We want to bring that back. We want to bring our own systems of governance back, which were much more democratic, where women who were not involved are now being empowered to also be involved in the decision-making process. And in this case, 90 villages have got together to create a Mahagram Sabha to sort of look at the entire landscape and how do we govern it in a way that we have complete livelihood security. We protect the forest on which we now have rights. And of course, also we create our own cultural identity or revive it, and women's empowerment and so on and so forth. And so if you think of a lot of these sorts of examples from villages, a real self-reliance or Gram Swaraj or Atmanirbharta is these sorts of examples, where people are reviving the village economy so well that in fact out-migration is reduced or stopped, and there's reverse migration where people have sometimes come back also. And you can actually do this all over India if only there was adequate support for it. Now, quickly thinking of cities, because it's not, even if all villages become self-reliant, we will still, of course, have cities. And we know that cities have huge problems of unsustainability, of inequality, and so on. So here, this is Bhuj, not a big city, about 200,000, 250,000 people. But what's happening there, I think, has very important lessons for all urban areas, where in several of the local, what used to be slum colonies, people have been empowered to know their rights, to demand accountability from the administration, but also to move towards more self-reliance with things like housing, water, energy, and so on, so that they're not dependent on anybody outside. And please remember that Kutch is India's lowest rainfall area, and yet several colonies here have become self-reliant with just harvesting the rainfall. This is also true of more than 100 villages in Kutch. Um, so you see that kind of thing happening with poor colonies, but also with middle-class citizens' actions in some parts of India. For instance, in Bangalore, the citizens' action to revive the Kaikondrahalli Lake, which was otherwise being eyed by the land mafia for construction, or the actions by Rainbow Drive, top right-hand side picture that you see, where they move towards 100% waste recycling, 100% water recycling, and many other sort of things to reduce their footprint on the outside world and to live much more sustainably. We now also have many more zero waste shops. I remember when I was a kid, I used to go to the nearby grocery shop and get virtually everything without any packaging. Today, you go and try and buy anything at all, it's in plastic or thermal, I mean, different sort of layers and layers of packaging, which is so wasteful. So now we have these zero waste shops in some cities, at least, which are bringing that kind of thing back. Unfortunately, though, very expensive. So we also have to look at how do we make these available to the poor. Now, we have documented about 25 cases of this kind of community resilience in COVID times. These are the 2 volumes we've come out with. We're coming out with many more, and we hope to have at least 100 examples over the next few months. I'll put up the links to these documents when I finish. We have them available in 6 or 7 languages, so please do take a look. Quickly moving into a couple of other sectors, and then I'll look at what sort of the larger picture emerging from these examples. We know that one of our biggest problems or challenges is the education system. Not only the fact that it's inaccessible to a large number of poor people, but even more problematically, the kind of education that's given is something where youth are supposed to basically learn so that you fit into the current system. You fit into the capitalist or the statist system. And we're not sort of given the opportunity to express our own creativity, to be people who are questioning, to become responsible human beings, to think of collective, not just individual selfishness. And so we need alternative education and learning. And these are some examples here. I don't have the time to go into all of them, but there are some amazing examples of alternative learning and schools and colleges where kids are coming up, being able to express their own creativity and do things as a collective rather than as individual selfishness. All the examples I'm putting on here are also available on our Vikalp Sangam website as stories or case studies if you want to look at them. And to my mind, so one of the things I'm very fond of doing is looking at origins of words. And I found recently when I started working on this that the origin of the word school is skole in Greek, which meant leisure. Now, can you imagine 90% of India's schools are actually prisons? They're nothing to do with leisure. But learning with leisure is actually what schools should be. The same with technology, where, in the last few decades, we've kind of assumed that technological development only happens in the IITs and the corporations and the technology centers. But in fact, most technological innovation through history has happened by so-called ordinary people. How do we bring that back? How do we re-democratize technology? And again, here are some examples, whether it's with architecture or with energy, or it's with clothing, or with other forms of technology that we need in our lives. There's some amazing examples of much more democratic, much more ecologically sensitive and locally controlled technologies. Just to give you a couple of examples from the pictures here, the bottom left-hand side is the building of SecMol, one of the alternative learning centers in Ladakh. And they've made it with passive solar architecture, and it's made by the students and the faculty. in such a way that even if it's minus 20, 30 degrees outside, inside the building, you can sleep without any artificial heating. Imagine the energy saving of something like that. The opposite of that, in 42, 43 degrees in summer, the top right-hand picture is the office of Hunarshala in Kutch, which is built using a lot of traditional technologies with mud and thatch and so on. And you can be sitting inside with just a fan, even when it's 43, 44 degrees outside. So you actually you can see the kind of innovations that people are capable of, so-called ordinary people are capable of, if given a chance. The same, and this is my final set of examples, is with regard to media and communications and arts, which also have been captured either by the state, Doordarshan, All India Radio, etc., or by corporations. Virtually all of our mainstream media is captured by corporations. And so do you really get the real news, or do you get news that's filtered through the lenses of these institutions? And so how does one create alternative learning space, alternative media and communication spaces where people's voices can come out? So again, these are some examples. One I found very interesting is in Chhattisgarh, a mobile-based radio kind of a setup called CG Netswara, which enables any ordinary villager with even a small so-called dumb phone to be able to communicate his or her problems or his or her innovations, which then goes out to a very large number of people without being blocked by by governments or corporations. So now when all of this happens, when people do this, you also find, of course, that the practical examples and the advocacy and pressure from the public enables the government or people within the government who want to do also good things to actually act. And we've seen at least a few positive examples of this in the last 2-3 decades, whether it's laws like the Right to Information Act, or it's policies on organic farming or renewable energy, or the example of Kudumbushi that I gave, and others where the state can also be enabled and pressurized to take positive action, leading towards the opportunities for these alternatives to flourish much more. Moving to some examples from the rest of the world, just 2 or 3 that I'm going to give very quickly. The one, again, that's very inspiring for me is the movement of the Kurdish ethnic community in the middle of the most war-torn area of the world, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran border area. And this Kurdish ethnic community that's been prosecuted in all of the countries by the dominant communities has tried to create its own autonomous zone of peace and eco-feminist based peace, using an ideology they call genealogy, with J-I-N, which means women's a sort of feminist kind of ideology, but also principles of ecology, and very direct, radical democracy, which is to say every commune, every community there has its own decision-making process, and then they federate over larger areas. This area is constantly in trouble. A few months back, Turkey had invaded it militarily, and of course, so they have to innovate all the time. These are examples from Europe, which I was fortunate enough to visit, of what's called solidarity, or the social and solidarity economy. So the top bottom left-hand side is what's called alternative or community currencies, where the desire is to not completely break away, but be somewhat independent of the centralized euro, because people have no control over the euro or the dollar or the rupee. So creating one's own local currency for local exchanges. So using the Becky, this case of Luxembourg on the bottom left-hand side, using the Becky, which is equivalent to the euro, I can go to a baker shop and buy bread. The baker can go to a farmer and buy wheat. The farmer can go to a doctor and get treatment. So you actually localize the exchange, you stimulate the local economy, and you create social relationships along with the economic ones. The top right-hand side is another interesting example where without money, how do you create services and goods to be exchanged? So they use something called time banking, where every person in that community says, okay, I can give 5 hours of free yoga lessons or physics lessons in a school in that community. And in return, I might get something else from somebody else in the community, but it's my contribution to the community. And through that, they actually run this very high quality school with very cheap rates. So even the poorer families can put their kids there. Top left-hand side is a non-profit cafe, where young people in many parts of Europe are saying, we want to do enterprise, but we don't want to make huge profits from it. Of course, we have to get our revenue, our expenses back. But at the same time, we're also expressing our social solidarity. For instance, this cafe in Athens employs refugees and so-called disabled people deliberately as a means of extending solidarity to them. Similar movements of what's called feminist municipalism in Barcelona, for instance, a woman mayor over the last 7-8 years has tried to create a very different form of politics and have her eyes always close to the ground and trying to see what is it that communities really need and how do you actually undermine the corporate control over the city and actually create much more democratic control. All right, I'm done with examples. I want to now take the next maybe 10 minutes or so to look at the what's the overall framework or frameworks that are emerging from this. And we call it the flower of transformation. In the Vikalp Sangam process, we've kind of done a lot of collective discussions and visioning on this. This flower of transformation has these 5 different spheres. Politics on the top right-hand side, economics, right-hand side, society, bottom right-hand, culture and knowledge, bottom left-hand, and ecology on the left-hand side. And it's actually transformations in these 5 spheres that we are seeing in these different examples. And none of them have all of it happening, but different ones have it, and you can actually put a holistic picture together of the kind of transformations needed. Now, with much more time, I would have elaborated each one of these. I'm going to go into only 2 of them, but which is politics and ecology. But let me quickly mention the other 3. So economic democracy is really about, for instance, the Dalit women saying Anna Swaraj, food sovereignty. For basic needs, it is our control. It should not be in the control of anybody else. It's producers saying that for means of production have to be in the control of the producers, not in the control of capitalist owners. It's localized exchanges much more than globalization. It's holding the economic resources and nature especially as not privatized, but in the commons, which is for everybody's good. And it's also recognizing the enormous contribution of elders and of women to the economy, which is never counted in the GDP kind of a process, the economy of caring and sharing and so on. The bottom left-hand side, culture and knowledge, which I won't go into detail, so let me just quickly mention here, especially important in today's time, the assertion of cultural diversity, the assertion of knowledge diversity, and not the hegemony and the control of one religion or one form of knowledge like modern science and technology, but to recognize and respect a range of them, a diversity of them, and create possibilities of coexistence amongst them. And finally, of course, the bottom right-hand side, social justice, is crucial because the Dalit women farmers were not talking only about food. They were also talking about the fact that as Dalits, they need to be given much more respect. As women, they need to be given much more respect. So struggles for social justice. And at the core of this, and I'll come to this in a couple of minutes, is a set of ethical values and principles. Let me very quickly go into the radical democracy, the politics part of it, and emphasize just 2 things. One, if we listen to the principle being enunciated by the Korchi Mahagram Sabha in the Gadchiroli, what they were arguing is, yes, we elect a government in New Delhi or in Mumbai, but in our village, we are the government, which is to say, wherever we are the ones who are part of decision making. We don't leave it to politicians and bureaucrats. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Many other parts of this democracy, but the other one that I want to talk about is how, if we think of putting politics and ecology and culture together, we also have to start questioning our political boundaries, both the ones within India and the nation state boundaries in South Asia or Europe or wherever we are, because these are often accidents of history, or they are deliberate impositions by colonial powers. And so we can think of South Asia, for instance, as not split into these hard nation state with hyper nationalist kind of India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, China, Sri Lanka, etc., but much more porous, much more where people and wildlife are able to go back and forth as they used to originally, and create zones of peace in these border areas. We can talk much more about that later if somebody's interested. The other sphere I want to emphasize is ecology, because without actually repairing our relationship with the rest of nature, we're all doomed. However rich and powerful we might be, we're all doomed. We have seen with climate crisis and the kind of impacts that even whether you're rich or poor, you can be equally impacted by wildfires, by floods, by typhoons, etc. Of course, the poor are more badly affected, but it's not as if the rich can be spared. So how do we actually recognize what indigenous peoples and other local communities have recognized forever, which is that human beings are not at the top of the evolutionary pyramid, which is the modern scientific way of looking at it, but human beings are one out of thousands or millions of species. And for us to create then and bring back the humility of us being part of a much larger set of life, and how do we kind of rebuild that? So in India, we started thinking about this in the form of what we call Eco-Swaraj, or my colleague Asim Srivastava calls it Prakritik Swaraj, or radical ecological democracy. And radical, another of those words which I like to talk about, because radical does not mean killing each other. It means going to the roots. So, when we say radicalized youth, actually it would be fantastic, because all youth would be going to their own cultural and ecological roots, of course, learning from others. And so thinking of radical ecological democracy, very simple. Wherever we are the decision makers. And of course, we make governments accountable to us. But as decision makers, we are responsible to others, other human beings, and to other species, to the rest of nature. So therefore, radical ecological democracy, where you bring justice and sustainability together. There are similar concepts in many other parts of the world. Even in India, different communities have different similar concepts, which I'm not going to go into these in details, but the book, which I'll show you in the end, has many examples of these. Some of these are alternative worldviews that have been there for thousands of years from indigenous peoples. Some are very new, coming out of the industrial West, for instance. Degrowth or ecofeminism are coming from as reactions to the kind of excesses that the industrialized society has gone through. So finally, then, the core of that flower of transformation, to my mind, is a set of ethical principles. I'm just putting these up on the screen. We can go into some of these in the discussion if you want, but essentially we're talking about values that are very different from what the dominant society is telling us. If we take bullet point 4, for instance, in the school, in a classroom, I should not be taught that I have to come first and leave everybody behind. But what I should be enabled to do is to work with all the other school kids in my class, and so that everybody is moving up. It's cooperation, it's collectivity, it's solidarity, it's commons versus the private. Or if you take the third last bullet point, it's not just non-violence in terms of physical violence, but even thoughts, the way we speak, the way we relate to other species. Or we take autonomy, for instance, or self-reliance. I've already told you, this is not Modi ji's self-reliance. This is true self-reliance, where people are able to control their lives and meet their basic needs in their own way. Now, if you put all these different things together, what I think we need in terms of the packages, the COVID resilience, sorry, the COVID recovery packages that are being announced by governments all over the world, is not the same old thing where you bail out banks and you bail out the big industries, etc. Nor is it even just the Green New Deal, which is coming up in the USA and in Europe, etc. But it's actually multiple revolutions of multiple colors, so that several aspects of justice, LGBTQ, gender justice, ecological justice, etc., are coming together in the recovery from COVID. And it's when we do this, when we combine the local practical alternatives that I've given you examples of with these worldviews and with networking, so that you create greater scale of this kind of transformation, when you connect that grassroots to the global, when you connect the resistance movements to the constructive alternatives, and we also give ourselves space to dream, to vision, not always, get bogged down by what's realistic only, then we can think of these kinds of transformations at a much larger scale. So let me end by just talking quickly about two processes that that I have been privileged to help to start. One is Vikalp Sangam, started in 2014. It's an attempt to try and bring together movements, organizations, communities, individuals who are working for these sorts of alternatives in different fields of life: education, health, livelihoods, conservation, etc. And also document wonderful examples. So the website at the bottom of the screen already has about 1,500, 1,600 stories and examples of these alternatives. That's the website. Please take a look. If ever you are feeling depressed in life, please go to this website. I guarantee you will cheer up at least for some time. These three books are all available for free download. I'll give you the links. The one on the top left-hand side is an attempt to get 40 people in India experienced in their own fields, like education and sexuality and gender and conservation and health and so on, to write about their dream vision of India in 2100, and then come back down to the current situation and say, how do we get there? What are the pathways? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? The book in the middle is the global book with 100 examples of radical alternatives around the world. And the one on the top right-hand side is 9 very detailed case studies of transformation from different parts of India. Similar to Vikalp Sangam, we have also initiated last year a global process of bringing these sorts of different networks of alternatives in different parts of the world together in a horizontal way, so weaving of a tapestry rather than just one global organization, more like a process. You can see more of this in the website given at the bottom. So I think with that, I'd like to end. That's my email ID for anybody who wants to have a further dialogue on any of these issues, and some more websites that you can take a look at. I'll just keep it up for a few seconds and then I'll stop the share. So thank you again for this opportunity, Father Christy, Raghu, and others. I hope I haven't taken much more time than I was supposed to, and I would love to have a discussion on this. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your highly informative, thought-provoking, and inspiring oration. I now request Professor Tata L. Raghuram, Chairperson of Father Arupe Center for Ecology and Sustainability and Associate Professor of Strategic Management Area at XLRI, to moderate the question and answer session.
Hi, thank you very much, Ashish, for that wonderful oration. Now I request the participants to type in their questions in the chat box. Okay, as they come in, we will start taking the questions, and Ashish will answer them. I will pose the questions to Ashish. To start with, Ashish, what avenues of cooperation does Kalpavriksh envisage with management institutions? Because is there a gap which needs to be bridged as far as managers of today and Eco-Swaraj are concerned?
Yeah, Raghu, I think there is a huge gap. I mean, to the extent I understand management institutions, I don't understand them all fully. But where I have visited and given lectures and seen some of the syllabi, I think places like XLRI are somewhat exceptional, because you do have things where you're bringing in sort of real life stuff, you're bringing in social issues, ecological issues, etc., as far as I know. But most management institutions are basically looking at management in a very conventional way. You don't challenge the current systems. You just say, okay, how do you manage them better? How can you have a more efficient running of industry, for instance? How can you do digital stuff rather than non-digital, etc.? So it's thought of in a very managerial way. And like I'm saying, okay, let me put it like this. Management is about how do you do something. Governance is about who decides what to do and how do you do something. And unless we look at the governance part, which is to say the democracy part of it, and how current democracy does not really give power to the people, we're always going to fall short on the management front. And we're always going to think of management from the perspective of those who are currently dominant, whether it's government or it's corporations. And I think that's a fundamental change that needs to happen in management institutions. In fact, they should all become management and governance institutions, and much more of a flavor of community decision-making processes, bringing in local managers who may have no education, they may be completely so-called illiterate, but they manage their forests brilliantly, they manage their water brilliantly, bringing those voices in, enabling that interaction to take place so that you think of managers as not only those who've gone through formal training, but others, and bringing in the political, the democratic aspects also. I think these are some of the fundamental changes that need to take place. To put it again somewhat briefly and simplistically.
Thanks for that response. I think you have answered it, nailed the issue. Now, one of the issues that you often talk about, and you mentioned it today, is also the environmental sanity. Okay, how best can we understand this phrase given today's context of consumerism and a global demand for resources?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it is currently ecologically insane. Last week, I saw an example of somebody buying pear juice in the US, which had come from a processing plant in Brazil, and the pears had come from Indonesia or somewhere. I mean, just imagine what you can probably grow in your own backyard or not too far from where you're living. You're actually getting in a global chain, which is, and all of it is fossil fuel based. So we're talking about every one of our consumption patterns creating an impact on the earth, which collectively becomes completely unsustainable. So how do we change that? That's a huge challenge, of course, given that we're all, including me, are caught up in various kinds of consumption patterns that are unsustainable. I think we need to do 3 or 4 things. And again, I'm speaking very briefly. I can send an article that I've done on consumption, which has much more detail. Number 1, we need to think of not just a poverty line below which nobody should be there, but an upper consumption line, or what I call a sustainable consumption line. And nobody should be living above that. I mean, why should you have air conditioners in every room of the house? Why should you have 3 cars for every family, etc.? I'm talking about the 5% of India or 10% of India that has this kind of consumption patterns, right? And especially the 1%, which is like I gave the example of Ambani with his 27-story house. So one is that. But very importantly, that this is not something that the government brings in and imposes on us. It is something that has to be built through social dialogue and discussion and so on, where, you know, neighbors envy owners' pride. I think that was the Oneida television advertisement. Let's reverse that. Neighbors' non-ownership, owners' non-ownership or person's non-ownership and neighbors' enemies. For instance, I live without a fridge. I've lived without a refrigerator for the last 15 years. I would love it if my neighbor came and said, oh, wow, maybe we can also live without a fridge. That's cool. Okay, so, and why can't that happen? Because this change has happened only in the last 2 generations, Raghu. When I was in school, we used to use our pencil till it was this small.
Yeah.
We used to call it a Gandhi pencil.
They're from the same generation.
Yeah. So you and I know this. And in 2 generations, it's changed to saying, if anybody's seen using a pencil that small, don't your parents have money to buy you a new pencil? We can change it back in a generation or 2. So that's one thing. Second, we need role models. And I don't mean film stars and cricket stars and so on. Ordinary people, young people. In fact, a lot of young people are becoming role models. They're getting enormous coverage on Instagram and Facebook and so on. People who were never known, but they've done something really innovative. So we need much more of that. Third, we need to create systems by which alternatives are easily available. So when we say consumption of plastic, for instance, for bags, or like I said, the zero waste shops, those through our own pressure have to become much more common so that people who are ecologically literate, ecologically empowered, have also a choice, because otherwise I can be ecologically literate, but I don't have a choice. I will continue to be wasteful. At least these 3 things and many more others things. And yes, and sorry, and we have to press for a upper salary limit. Wherever, private corporations, government, whatever. The salaries have gone completely through the roof. You know, what the kind of earnings people are doing. Switzerland tried that. They did a referendum where I think the vote for having a salary limit was defeated by a very narrow margin, which means about 48 or 40 something percent wanted it, 51, 52% didn't want it. We have to build up the narrative to enable us to also demand that there has to be salary limits. That's another thing that is enormously contributing to consumption patterns.
Interesting. One related question that came up in the chat box. Now, majority of the population is still is aspirational. Okay, they have just come out of poverty, and there's luxury is defined in a certain way. All of that puts more demand for goods and services, whereas the mindsets that you are proposing, a change in mindsets towards Eco-Swaraj requires a very different definition of luxury or lifestyle. How do we make this transition happen? It is the toughest challenge for this transition, I believe, is in the mindsets.
Absolutely. But, I think we have an incredible opportunity here. So, for instance, my visit to Kunaria village, which I spoke about briefly last week, one of the things they're thinking of is how do they spend 40 lakh rupees a month on household products, 40 lakh a month, just that population of 3,500 people. Buying things that can be easily produced in and around the village, or say a cluster of 10 villages, right? Soaps, footwear, oils, etc., etc. Now, if they were to move towards that, out of a desire to be much more self-reliant and be much more resilient in times of crisis like COVID, at the same time, discussions can start, in fact, have started in that village, of how do we produce these in ecologically sensitive ways? And how do we even reduce the demands that we have? Because we don't need all this stuff, right? So it is this kind of, and in the schools there, in the boys and the girls school, they've introduced these dialogues so that a new generation is coming up facing both the attractions of the modern consumerist thing, but also, and knowing at least a little bit about its impacts, but also the possible alternatives. And for instance, in Bangalore, living in a mud house is just about beginning to get fashionable. Now, suppose we were to go to Kunaria and say that, why do you want to move to concrete and cement? It's hotter in the summer, it's colder in the winter, and you have your bunga structure, a round structure, and you create it, and you do it in ways which mix tradition and modern, rammed earth technology, etc., etc. And you can actually be living in houses where tourists will come and say, oh, wow, this is really great. So aspirations can also be changed, not by dumbing down, not by saying, oh, no, you can't have this, you can't have that, but to say, yes, it's a valid aspiration that I want a better house or I want better transportation or whatever. But here are alternative ways which in fact are becoming cool all over the world. We copy the West in all kinds of wrong things. Let's copy Europe in terms of what it's done with cycling. Every big city there has the best cycle lanes, and three-piece businessmen in three-piece suits are cycling. Politicians are cycling. Want to be aspirational? Think of that kind of a thing for our youth also. So it's a difficult challenge. I'm not belittling the challenge, but it's possible. It's doable.
No, I read somewhere the true development is when the richest man in the country uses the public transport.
Yes.
Okay. There's another interesting question that came up. Can the strategy of regional resource-based manufacturing help in promoting social and environmental well-being in India?
Absolutely. If I understand the words correctly, regional resource-based manufacturing, in fact, I think is absolutely essential. Again, for both self-reliance and for ecological sustainability and for dignity, for dignified livelihoods. So let's take another example, which I didn't give. It was there briefly in one of the slides. Kutambakkam near Chennai, where this ex-Dalit Sarpanch called Ilango Rangaswamy, he when he was Sarpanch for two times, he actually managed to create local manufacturing base using, to some extent at least, local resources, such that about 200-300 families that were having to go to Chennai for work or elsewhere could actually get dignified livelihoods in the village itself. Kudumbashri is a great example of that. 5 million women being able to do this across Kerala. Jharcraft in Jharkhand did that to some extent. I don't know the current situation, but maybe Raghu, one of you might know better. They enabled craftspeople to, and 300,000 families is from what I remember 10 years back, to get much more dignified livelihoods using their own skills, maybe some upgradation, maybe some new products, but basically using their own skills. So a range of small scale manufacturing, from crafts to producing even things like solar panels. In Kutumbakam, they're producing solar kit, which can be very quickly assembled, to even services. There's absolutely no reason why the Reliances and the Tatas and so on should be getting all the service contracts. You can actually be doing this in a very decentralized way with adequate training. It doesn't take humongous, it's not rocket science. So retail, why should the Birlas and so on get the retail shops? I mean, we've had decentralized retail for hundreds of thousands of years. We can actually enhance that by creating the retail as a service opportunity for in a decentralized way. All of this is not just possible, I think it's absolutely essential if we don't want our society to collapse in the way that it's already beginning to collapse. And that is true self-reliance to me.
Another observation that came up is many of the examples that you cited seem to be coming from certain parts of the country. You know, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, or Gujarat. Is there, are there any certain reasons for concentration of local innovations prospering in certain geographical locations in this country?
I actually thought I'd given examples from enough geographical locations to make it a much more national thing. I brought in Nagaland, I brought in Kutch, I brought in Tamil Nadu, and I did very quickly. There was Kerala, there was Gadchiroli in central Maharashtra, there was, there was Bangalore, there was Bhuj. Had I had another 2-3 hours, I could have given many more examples from virtually all the states. But yes, I mean, one does see, I don't know if there's any systematic study of this.
No, this is not, are there any certain patterns?
Yeah, I'm just coming to that, yeah. So, I mean, there's no systematic study really to be able to see this, but certainly it seems that, for instance, community action and civil society action, given that they have a historical base, may be more concentrated in some parts of the country. Maharashtra, for instance, has very active civil society organizations. Kerala, of course, for all the historical and political reasons. Whereas some, for instance, maybe, I don't know, Tripura or I don't know, some part, not, I wouldn't say Bihar as a whole, but some parts of it, Eastern UP, maybe these are areas where you haven't had so much of a history of civil society organization, of community mobilization of the kind we need. And of course, there are also issues like casteism and gender discrimination, where it's very deep rooted. It is more difficult to mobilize communities and civil society than where it is not. But yet, and I think it's very important to emphasize this, even in such areas and even in such communities, there are examples. And I think we need to learn, how did they break through the barriers? How did they get enabled to actually do this? Was it their own leadership? Was it somebody coming from outside and enabling it? Was it a certain policy that enabled it? What is it? What are the factors? But unfortunately, there is no systematic study of this. In fact, alternatives has been an area of study that's been very badly neglected. And we hope, I mean, if XLRI would like to do something on this, or anybody else, then we'd be very happy to work with you.
That's one area we can explore to collaborate.
Yeah.
And another interesting question that came up, will a reduced consumption lead to lesser employment opportunities?
It's possible that in the immediate future, that's the next 2, 3, 4 years, that will happen. But that's going to happen with the reduction of fossil fuels. It will happen with, for instance, if we want to eliminate at least a part of plastics from our life. If we want to reduce toxic materials that are killing us, then yes, there is going to be some level of lesser employment or unemployment, which is why it's very important that the COVID recovery package is a recovery package that enables the redeployment of people away from ecologically and socially destructive processes to ecologically sensitive ones. And if you do that within a relatively short period, there's a United Nations Environment Program study on this, in fact, a UNEP study on ecologically sensitive livelihoods, or green jobs as they call it, which shows that within a very short period, you will actually increase employment. So public transportation has a greater employment potential than private transportation. Organic farming has a greater employment potential than chemical-based farming, etc. You can think of all of these. Crafts, 200 million people can be employed in local, just craft. I'm not even talking about other small-scale manufacturing. I'm just talking about crafts. If you were to move, suppose, for instance, textile workers in a factory, it's not so difficult to reskill them to actually be able to do, say, handmade stuff or other things that they might already be good at. In fact, many of them are people who were handicrafts or handloom workers whose jobs have been destroyed, and they've moved into working in a factory. So it might take 10 years, okay? But we've lost 75 years already. Let not do another 75 years and everything collapses and they say, oh my God, this is what we should have done, which is Gandhi's or many other people's dream in any case. So yes, there will be organic farming. If chemical-based farmers have to shift to organic farming, there'll be a 2 or 3 or 4 year drop in production. That's exactly when, for instance, subsidies or support from government or civil society is needed. And then production comes back as the earth regenerates its productive capacity. That's the experience with a lot of farmers who've shifted from chemical to organic. So some hand-holding of that kind, some reskilling, etc. is needed. And we're putting 90,000 crores of rupees into chemical fertilizers. Imagine putting that subsidy into organic farming to enable this shift to take place. So we need that kind of policy shift also.
That's wonderful. I think we have just enough time for one last question. What do you see are as the biggest barriers for these transitions to happen?
Okay, I'm not talking in order of priority, but here's a mix of things. Failure of imagination. We have submitted ourselves to the brainwashing that this is the only way to develop. And so we're not even breaking out of that kind of, you said mindset, right? It's not breaking out of that kind of mindset to imagine other ways of living and being. That's one. Second, this imagination doesn't have to come out of the air. It's there already in the grassroots, in communities, in indigenous people, Adivasis and others, in Dalit women, and in urban middle-class people who've broken out of the mold, etc. It's there. So the second thing is much more learning, cross-learning. And we don't have that. So that's a big challenge, right? Third, fighting the forces of both capitalism and statism and patriarchy. These are, and casteism. I mean, so I'm naming all of them, but these are obviously huge challenges. You can't do make these holistic transformations without that. So these are massive things. Fourth, confidence. Maybe that comes as part of number one. In Kunaria, when I went to the village, or the Dalit women farmers example, many of the examples I gave you, amongst the first things that was done was a slow process of rebuilding self-confidence, that I and we as a community can take back control. We can make things happen. We don't have to be begging the government all the time. That self-confidence at the local to the national level, again, has to be, it's very severe. 200 years we've been told, no, government will do it for you. तुम बैठो आराम से, हम तुम्हारा पानी देंगे, हम तुम्हारी बिजली देंगे, ये करेंगे, वो करेंगे. So we say, okay, we're sitting back, but of course those who actually get it are very few. तो वो एक, sorry, I switch to Hindi, sometimes people might not understand. That's one of the huge barriers, the lack of self-confidence. So all of these are there, but all of them have been broken and overcome in these examples. And even if they're exceptional examples, the fact that they're there suggests that we can actually do this across the entire landscape.
Thank you very much, Ashish. It's now my privilege is to propose a vote of thanks. Life on Earth is facing an existential threat due to climate change and the loss of ecological integrity. Social, economic, ecological inequalities are widespread and are a major reason for conflicts across the world. A false belief that natural capital can be substituted by man-made technology is leading us to unviable trade-offs and unsustainable outcomes. This business as usual attitude must be replaced by radically different alternatives for life to survive on this planet. Maintaining ecological integrity has to be the pivot for global governance, and radical ecological democracy is one such powerful alternative governance framework. I thank Ashish Kothari for accepting XLRI's invitation and delivering a very thought-provoking oration. I fondly recollect our association, my association with Ashish Kothari, first when I contributed a chapter on the impact of dams on biodiversity in India for the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, which Ashish Kothari coordinated. And the second, Ashish is a member of the Advisory Council of Father Arupe Center for Ecology and Sustainability. FACES looks forward to benefit from Ashish's wisdom. Now, I thank Professor Madhukar Shukla, the founder chairperson of FACES, for laying a very strong foundation for FACES. And I assure you, sir, we'll do our best to take forward your work and make FACES a viable center for ecology and sustainability. I thank Father Christie, Director XLRI, Father Donald De Silva, Dean Administration, Dr. Ashish Pani, Dean Academics, for their support and cooperation. I thank the IT department of XLRI and all the faculty, staff, and students for their cooperation and support. A special thanks is to the audience for participating in this event online. Please wear a mask, maintain social distancing, and keep safe. Thank you very much. That's all from XLRI. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.